solidified after the Second World War, according to which you cannot build houses in the countryside, not without very special permission, because people valued the countryside. We're, as you know, an overcrowded little island, and wanted to preserve it. And this law creates certain duties on the part of the citizen, obviously to obey it, not to build just anywhere, anyhow. And people accepted it as a piece of legislation. It doesn't talk about anybody's rights. It just talks about what duties are under the law. But then Irish travellers enjoying freedom of movement under the European Union laws come and settle in our countryside with their caravans, scraping away the topsoil, putting down concrete, and littering the place with these, what to you Americans would call trailer parks. Right. And then, of course, this is against the law. But they appeal to the European Court of Human Rights, saying that we have a right, as an ethnic minority, to live in our traditional way. And this is our traditional way. Now, if the court upholds that judgment and says that they do have a right, then all other interests are cancelled by it, because a right is a non-negotiable privilege. Right. Whereas the neighbours of these people just have whatever ordinary legislative rights and duties have been laid down. So, the result is that this law is no longer applicable. This isn't me, is it? No. One thing that happens as a result of that, of course, is that is social tension. Right. Indeed, we've already had a couple of murders in one of these camps as a result of this. Most people don't accept the fact that they, having obeyed the law to maintain the beautiful environment in which they were, can see it just taken away from them by people who don't have to obey the law because they can overreach it through these international courts. But increasingly that is happening, that overreaching of the law through the doctrine of human rights and through these claims that people make, claims to lifestyle and so on.
So you're suggesting that there really is nothing to appeal once you reach a certain state?
Well, this is a technical problem, but in our law, and I think in all laws, if something is a right attaching to an individual, then that's it. Right. The judge is obliged to grant it. Okay. There can be conflicts of rights, but you see, the neighbours of the travellers, in the case I'm considering, didn't have any rights in the matter. Right. They just had interests. Right. So the court had no way of judging in their favour.
Sure. But often laws are made with interest in mind.
Oh yes, and that's the whole purpose of legislation, that it tries to take all the interests into consideration and find an acceptable compromise solution. Right. And that's only one example that I took, but there are plenty that are much more relevant perhaps to life in this part of the world. Although I suspect the European Court of Human Rights will certainly upset relations between Hungarians and Roma in this country by overriding settled ways of dealing, and you might have the same sort of problem. But more important are things like the conflict that arises between the Catholic worldview and this new concept of human rights. Catholics have always said, we were the true originators of the human right idea. Look at St. Thomas, it's all there, the concept of natural law. And we uphold human rights, and we believe indeed that there is this universal jurisdiction which is God's. But these rights are not for us to determine according to political criteria or according to the desires of people in secular society, they are eternal. So, for instance, although there is a right to life, the Roman Catholic will say that right attaches to the unborn too, to the child in the womb. And the European Court of Human Rights will say no, because that interferes with the right to abortion that we guarantee, because it's part of what is offered by way of settling disputes in a secular society. Right. So the Polish government has had to confront this, and I'm not sure that it's resolved it yet as to whether it can change, whether it's going to change its law on abortion or not.
Right. So you seem to be suggesting that the phrase "different strokes for different folks" sounds all well and good, but in fact, when you have such maybe radically different ideas about justice and life and truth, and you have to build a society or live and make laws, have neighbors, that it can be an impediment and may actually not lead to toleration?
Well, we got off the topic of toleration. The influence of moral relativism is to say that, it's intolerant to make judgments at all. Right. This is what we find often said in my country, that someone being judgmental is committing the primary moral fault. And real toleration means not discriminating at all against against rival views, accepting all views as equally valid. But actually, toleration means the opposite of that. Toleration means accepting what you don't approve of, accepting what you do disagree with. And our tradition in England of toleration, which grew up in the 17th century, was a solution to radical conflict. People learnt to be tolerant precisely of the things that they really hated. Learning not to hate them means not tolerating at all, because there's nothing to tolerate. And this is a very important virtue in this case, toleration, but it depends upon having objective moral values.
Right. So in that sense, toleration, the way we might understand it today, is actually quite a bit different than maybe the Christian concept of brotherly love or the golden rule.
Yes, and I mean, the Christian concept of brotherly love means loving the sinner and hating the sin. Right. And I mean, that's a very different conception from the modern version, which is more like loving the sin and not regarding it as one.
Right. Well, before we turn to questions from the audience, let's discover what the absence of truth claims or making judgments, what that means in other areas of life. So you've written that in art and architecture, whereas maybe in art the original idea was to try to point the viewer of that sculpture or that painting towards some sort of higher plane and toward a closer realization of some sort of truth. And in architecture, of course, the main idea was to create structures that were to be inhabitable for humans to live or to work in. Has that changed?
No. It's much more difficult to defend some kind of objective aesthetics than it is to defend an objective morality. In the end, once you've stated the questions of morality clearly, an awful lot of it is plain common sense, as the name of your society commemorates. But plain common sense about art is quite difficult to obtain. In fact, it seems to me architecture is the only clear example in which people do spontaneously agree with each other. Everybody, that is to say, except architects. And that's because architects make money out of it. And I think you will find that certainly in the European context, there is a natural tendency to accept certain forms and to reject others. except forms which give the air of a settlement,
right.
a place where you can be at home. And that, because architecture is touching on something which is deeper than aesthetics, which is our need to settle together as communities. And from that need follow things like the shapes of windows, the shapes of roofs, the heights of buildings,
right.
and even things like details, you know, shadows. You can't live in a building, you can't look at a building which doesn't have shadows.
Right.
There's one over there which has none. Which is kind of glazed monstrosity, like a big eye looking at the people of Budapest and defying them. You know, it's not something in the shadow, in the vicinity of which you can actually feel at home. That's part of its purpose, because it's there to sell things, not to soothe people. But I think in the sphere of architecture you can draw on other things than the pure look of buildings in order to establish some kind of consensus, and it's very clear from the cities of Europe that that consensus has existed for at least 3,000 years, in a very broad sense.
Right.
You know, the column and the architrave, and the roof and the window. You know, these are standard things. When it comes to music and painting, things look a little bit different, but still. You know, there's an expectation in most morally alive people that art should not, as D.H. Lawrence puts it, do dirt on life. It shouldn't desecrate the ordinary expectations and the ordinary modes of fulfillment that people have. And, you know, obscenity, destructive violence, chaos, works about that seem to celebrate the negative. For that reason, I think, put people's teeth on edge and also give them a sense a sense of sacrilege sometimes. And working out that idea is one thing to which I've devoted, you know, some of my work. So I have a few things to say about it.
All right. Let's open it up for questions.
I think, yes, that these international human rights organizations are... Part of the problem with them is that, as you imply, that the agenda has grown uncontrolled. So we don't really know whether there is a human right to social welfare. You know, is there a human right to a roof over your head, or a human right to health? What would settle the question? Nobody knows. So, you know, I can obviously claim that I have a human right as a red-haired person to special privileges when traveling in places like this where there are so few of them. You know, and people do, but most people would laugh at it and say, no, that's ridiculous. But nevertheless, what are the grounds? Nobody knows. So that is part of the problem. There's an attempt to produce a kind of universal objective morality, but without any conception of where it comes from. The idea that people can't be judges in their own cause, of course, is universally accepted, only because everybody has an interest in their own cause other than its justice. You know, the fundamental idea of natural justice, at least in English law, is that a dispute between two people must be adjudicated by a third person who has no interest in either side. If you have no interest in the matter, only justice can motivate your decision. That's the idea. It is problematic. They have political agendas and all that, of course, and they get taken over by people who have decided